Ramesh. Good afternoon.
Hey, Raj.
Hi Ramesh.
Yeah. You
Hi.
can start the session.
Okay. Hi, Shashankar. Just can you introduce about yourself?
Yeah, surely. So basically, I passed out my engineering in computer science from New Horizon College. That's a Bangalore-based college. And since then, I'm working with Wipro Technologies, right? So throughout my tenure in IT, I have taken up various roles, starting with performance analyst, followed by DevOps engineer, and then I'm into Java development, like the backend part. And I carry like 2 years of experience in Java development. So when I say Java development, it does includes the core Java, then the Spring Boot framework, and then mostly the cloud native technologies, right? So I was more into Azure from past 2 years, right? So I've also touched various domains throughout my projects. So starting with the retail, which was for the Walmart project, then logistics and real estate, and followed by the healthcare domain. So that's the current project which I was working for. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So, actually, you written exam, right?
Yeah.
2 days back. So, how did you feel about that exam? Like, is it difficult or
No,
are any problems you faced with that requirement?
no, actually, I felt that was a new experience for me, to be honest. Usually, the kind of rounds I have been through, it is usually a problem statement is given and you are supposed to generate an algorithm, right? But this was a different approach, starting with, the requirement was specified in a document. We have to understand the requirement, analyze, then design the solution, followed by the development part, and again test it, right? So it does takes through the it's like a mini SDLC kind of a thing, right? So yeah, I did. I mean, I do feel it's a good way. I mean, and the kind of you know the solution I developed, I feel it was decently a good one.
Okay. So, you designed two classes, right? Model classes,
Yes.
right? So, in the classes you took private variables and you took for the setters and getters, right?
Yes.
Actually, generally, why should we go for a setter method? So I cannot take the public variables.
Yes. Now, see what happens is the way I have developed is, let's say the major, the main component, right? The main model is the catalog model, which holds two internal variables, right? So the data variables, that is the book and the laptop, right? So these two, even if I keep public, let's say, then again I'm giving a direct access to those variables, right? Anyone from any method, any class can access it. But again, when I keep them private, it ensures that only the catalog. It actually limits the audience which can actually entertain it. So it's the only the class, right? So when I say I have the getter and setter. See what happens is when I am saying a private, so even the object cannot directly access it, right? So of other classes or anything, so I need some way through which I can actually set these values, right? So in order to set the values, we have a setter method, and in order to retrieve these values, right, we go for the getter methods, and that is the usual.
Retrieve the values. I understood that we need a getter method we provided. But my question is you are restricting something, right? By making them as a private. I think you are seeing my screen, right?
Yeah.
Actually, this is the class you designed, right? So, but even you provided the set ID, right? Right. So here also you are allowing to the accessing that variable, right? By using set ID.
Yes.
Right? So my question is I don't want to provide the set ID. I will make this public. Okay. If I do like this, I don't know what is the problem we will get. Why should I provide this extra method here? I mean, if you don't provide the extra method, you are not seeing anything. Just they are setting the value, right?
Yeah. Again,
Still we are
that's the usual norm which we used to follow in our project. So for the model classes, like right, the variables we usually keep private, and then we give the setter method and the getter methods. Again, we used to have the Lombok extension, right? So we directly
so
specify the
usually we
annotation.
are following, everyone is following, that's why we are following, right?
Yes.
Or is there any purpose provided by Java? Why should we not give the public variables?
See, that's what, when we give public, right? So directly the access can be made, right?
I
So
don't have any problem even the access from directly, right? Anyhow, you are accessing by using set ID, right?
okay.
So for example, if I take the example like this, if I want to access this variable, what I have to do generally? I need to create an object, right? First,
Yep.
even though I have to access the public variable, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just assume I will create a book b is equals to new book.
Okay.
So b dot id is equals to 1 2 3. If it is a public variable,
Yeah.
or else if it is a setter method, set id of 1 2 3, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Instead of accessing like this, you are giving the access like this, right?
Yeah.
So what is the difference between these two? If I give, what is the problem if I give the access like this?
Okay. There is actually not a problem, but again, this is like the conventions we follow, right? So that's why I did it that way.
Okay, so you created the constructor, right? This is called constructor, right? I'm not
Yeah.
wrong. And why? And if you created the constructor again, why did you provided the setter method?
Yeah. I agree that once we have the constructors, setters are not really required. But again, there are let's say there is a scenario where I'm creating an object, right? So initially I'll be providing the values and it will create an object. But what if there is a scenario where I have to update the value, right? So that time I need to set. I mean, there should be a way to set the variables, right? So that's why we have the setters there.
Then I can go for always setter methods. I don't go for the parameterized constructor.
But again, if I don't have this thing, the default one. See, default one does initializes, but again, it will default to all the values, right? So let's say, if it's a string, it will be an empty string. It will, if an ID, or the values won't be there, right? So in order to make sure that that doesn't happens, I'm giving a constructor with the fields, right? So that once I'm creating, it will actually create an object.
Okay, so did you see any common properties between these two classes?
Yes, the ID and the price, I believe.
Okay, so then why you did not apply the inheritance? Because those are the common for all the models, right?
Yeah, we could have gone there. I mean, true.
So for this, like, what is the checked exception? What is the unchecked exception in this package? Is it a checked exception or unchecked exception?
It's an unchecked one. I have taken the runtime exception, right? So it's an unchecked one.
So what about this?
Same. It's also a runtime exception.
But as per the test, right? We are expecting. I think we are expecting one is a checked exception, right?
Okay.
Then why you created both are unchecked exceptions? Okay, how can I create a unchecked exception?
Unchecked.
Sorry, checked exception.
When I say checked exception, directly I can extend the exception class, right? So exception, when I say, then since it is a checked one, so I have to make sure that in the signature also it, it tells initially that okay, it will throw, there is a chance it will throw that particular exception in advance, right? So basically when we say checked and unchecked, they are basically the compile time and the runtime exceptions, right? So checked ones we have to specify, okay, there is a possibility, if this happens, it will be caught in the runtime, I mean the compile time itself. And since it's a runtime, when I say the unchecked ones, I cannot say okay, there is a chance that it might happen or there is a chance it might not happen, right? So that's the time where we go for the run, the unchecked ones. Let's say a file is not found or some data is not found in a search algorithm, like that. So I took the runtime because the exceptions which were expected were in the delete and in the search, right? So if we actually practically think, right, so it's not possible to really check in the compile time itself if the element is there or not, right? Which is a necessity for the search or and the delete, right? So that's why I went with the runtime, so that if it is not there, it will throw. If so that's the approach I took.
But even though we are expecting to create the unchecked exception, I mean, there is no possibility, but you can check at compile time. Right?
Yeah, that is possible.
If we check in and say that the method will throw the compilation, unchecked exception, so that the caller will handle that one. Right?
Yes.
Okay, so why should we use the interface in a project? What is the main advantage of interface?
So in order to understand why exactly interface is needed, we have to understand the concept of abstraction, right? So in order to attain the idea of abstraction, which simply simply means that, let's say, I will simply hide the main the implementation part, and I will just show the let's say we have a car, right? So we'll just show the driving, steering and everything, and we won't really be talking about how the engine is working internally, right? So in order to achieve the abstraction part, we go with the interfaces, right? And interface also tells like, let's say we have multiple classes, right? So interface specify these multiple classes will share some common functionalities, right? So let's say I have an animal class, is an animal interface, and there are various animal classes which is actually implementing this particular interface, and this interface has one method, that's a sound, right? So each animal, right, will have its own sound. So basically we will be overriding this particular method and specifying which animal is actually giving which particular sound in the when we create the concrete method for that particular class by overriding the interfaces method. So the idea is being, let's say multiple classes have a shareable behavior that will be specified in the interface. So it also decouples the whole program rather than specifying in the same class everything.
So how can I make a class which is not creating an object by other developers?
Can you repeat?
So I want you have to restrict other developers to create an object of a class. How can you do that?
Okay, so we can go with the singleton approach, right? Design pattern. So what we will simply do is we will make the constructor private, right? Then we will take a private static variable which will actually create the object, let's say the new animal class, right? And there will be a method to retrieve this particular value, right? So it will ensure that only one copy is being created.
Okay, so what is that method type?
Get instance.
Okay. So is it a normal method or
no, it will be a static one, since we are talking of static context, right? Yeah.
Okay. How can we handle to do not inherit a class from another classes? How can you do that?
Yeah, simply make the class final. So if we make the class final, then it won't be we cannot inherit it.
Okay, so what is the method overriding?
Okay, so method overriding is a part of polymorphism, right? So there are like two, right? So we have the dynamic and the static. So it's the dynamic one. So when I say overriding, basically, let's say when a class actually inherits from a parent class, so it will have a copy of the parents also, right? So let's say it is from the interface, right? So in the interface we don't really specify the definition of the method, right? So in those scenarios we have to specify the definition for this particular method in order to do some functionality, right? So that time we go with overriding. So the idea is quite simple. We'll directly annotate with override at override, and then we can give the definition to it, so it will directly override the function.
Okay, so you override the hash code, right, for this laptop.
Yes.
Why did you override this hash code method?
Okay, so
and where it is coming from?
Yes, so hash code, and you're also seeing the equals method, right? So these two methods are actually part of the object class, so which is actually the superclass of all the objects that we create or talk of, right? So these two do provide an default implementation, but those default implementations are actually not applicable in all the scenarios, right? Let's say starting with the equals. Let's say the default is it will directly check the reference variable, the address. If it is same, it actually returns like, okay, it is same or it is not same based on the reference address value, right? So but in normal scenario, when I say object 1 is equal to object 2 based on the fields or a specific field, let's say, right? So that time we go with equals, and then we give the implementation, our own implementation to the equals. And again, hash code comes into play when we have other let's say the collection framework, right? So let's say we have hash map or hash set or something. So the way they work based on the hash code, right? So we have to specify the method so that the object is going and sitting in the right bucket, right? So that's why.
So what is the purpose of toString method?
Okay, toString, again, it is a method of the object class itself. And let's say there is a scenario where I want to print the object. Let's say I'm trying to print an object without giving the toString. So what exactly happens is it will actually give the name followed by the, let's say, the hash code, right? So that's by default it gives, but that's not exactly what I want. What I want is the fields followed by the values they are holding, right? So in order to make sure that the object is exactly giving the same view as I want it to be, I'll be overriding the toString.
Okay, so then why you did not use the set? Because you overrided the hash code and equals, right? Why you go for the set collection here? Why you cannot use the list collection? Sorry, set collection here. Why did you use the list collection here?
Yeah, now the differentiating idea between the list and the set is duplicacy, right? So set is a collection of unique elements, while the list is a collection of various elements, right? It can also have the duplicacy. So when I say a catalog, there is a chance that there might be a scenario where I'm actually inserting a similar values, right? So that time it need to hold that value, because there are chances, let's say the price is only varying but everything else is same, right? So in those scenarios, yeah, a list handles better than set. Set can be used in those scenarios where we have some unique like unique elements, let's say a location, right? So a locations set can have, like, we don't want like two Indias there, right? In a country set, right? So I feel like list was a better choice there.
Okay, but in our exam, right? So we have given, like, when the book ID, name and other is same, then that is a unique book. Two books are equal when the name, ID and other is same. So in that case, right, so the books are unique, right? I have to maintain the unique books only, right, in my system.
Okay, when I read this statement, I pretty much understood it the way we have to implement the equals method. So I thought I'll do it basis on the fields.
So even they implement the equals method, when you store those objects into the collection, you will have the same duplicate objects, right?
Yeah. Yes. there's a possibility.
Okay, so what is the difference between linked hash set and reset?
Sorry, linked hash set.
Hash set and reset.
Okay, so set, right? Okay, yeah. So again, these two implement this set interface, right? So when I say linked hash set, internally the linked hash set actually uses the hash map, right? And the linked hash map. So when I say linked hash, let's talk about the hash set first. So hash set basically is a set of these unique collections, but again it doesn't maintains the insertion order, right? So when I say the linked hash set, it does maintains the insertion order. And talking of the tree set, again this actually sorts the elements right in their natural order if we are not giving specifying the comparator, right? If we're specifying the comparator, then again based on our custom compare method, it will do the sorting, right? So the idea is the linked hash map maintains the insertion order, right? And again it just maintains the insertion order. But talking of the tree set, again it will actually sort them also, right? It doesn't maintains the insertion order, but because obviously it is sorting, so the insertion order goes off, right?
Okay, so how can I get only keys from a map?
Okay, so let's say we have a map, so I'll go with the we have the map.entry, right? So I'll actually make up a set, right? And in the inside the did you send something message?
Just can continue.
Okay,
I am sending person.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, so we will actually have a set which will be followed by the map.entry set, right? So it will actually give me the set of the the values, it will actually be a set. So the values and the keys are actually set right internally. So that's how we can get it. So we'll use the map.entry set and then get the values.
I am creating two account objects.
Okay, let me check.
Just treat that as a two account objects. A and A2 are the two account objects.
Okay.
And if you observe that, right, ID and name is same for both the accounts. Right. So my condition is whenever the ID and name is same, then when I store it to the collection, it should have only one object. Okay. So when I store the A1 and A2 into hash set or like linked hash set, okay. So I written a condition saying that ID and same name are same, so that's why I have only one account object into the set, right? And I store the A and A2, right? Okay. So what is the amount of the account like when I get back from the collection?
Okay, so we are going with set, right?
Yes.
Okay, so it is specified that only one, the ID and the name is the criteria by which we are saving.
Yeah, uniqueness of the object is ID and name.
Okay, then the first value will be saved. 3000.
Are you sure it is not overriding?
No, it won't, right? I mean, if there is an object that is existing, right? So if it is already unique, so we won't be putting. So because if we actually see the implementation, right? So how it does is it uses the map, right? So what happens in the map is it will actually take the first value and the present value, and internally it compares. If it is same, right, it won't actually put it. If not, then it will actually put. So that's why since existingly it is there, so it won't put. So we'll have the 3001.
If it is a map, hash map.
Hash map, yeah, again, if it is hash map, then it will have both the values, right? Because it has nothing to do with uniqueness or something. It will put based on the values that are specified. Again, the order won't be there though. That is there.
Okay, let's suppose I want to display the accounts by amount. Okay. in ascending order. How can I do that?
Ascending order.
Yes.
Okay. So we can take like, okay, so how, okay, what is the problem statement?
Like this, I created 10 accounts and I stored those accounts into a collection.
Okay.
Okay, I want to display them into a in the by amount.
Okay.
Amount value in ascending order.
Okay. 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 So we can directly stream it, right? And then we can actually use the comparator. Okay, we can actually use the comparator there directly, right? So let's say I created the whole collection based on whichever collection I have taken. Yeah, let's
Can you
say.
tell me first what is the first what kind of collection you will prefer?
Yeah. Coming to that. So initially I'll take, let's say, a list, right? So I'll specify, I'll create the whole data set and then I'll put it there. So I have my collection ready, right? So I'll right now go with collections.sort, right? And inside the sort, like when I say sort, I can actually, it is like overloaded function, right? So I'll specify my AL, let's say account is my value for the list, right? So account comma, I'll actually specify the comparator. Now if I directly use the Java 8 thing, so I don't really have to specify a new class and all that. So directly I can give my integer dot compare. I can directly use there, and inside the integer dot compare I'll specify account dot, let's say I have 5,000 as my price, and then I'll get price. I can use that, right? So I'll just type how it will actually look like is, right? So it will be collection dot sort followed by account, and inside that now again two things. I can directly let's say specify I1 comma I2, which represents both the objects, and then inside that I'll actually directly go with tertiary operator where it will be I1 sorry, just 1 minute. Yeah.
So why are you making the this whole thing is just you can insert into the tree set, right?
Yeah, that is one approach again. But if let's say there is a tomorrow there is a requirement of descending order, right? So it is always better to have
descending order also is just enough of implementation of your comparator, right?
And anyway, the usual ordering, right? Let's say if it is a normal, let's say integer or a string, we can directly go with a sort. It gives the ascending order anyway. But since it is an object, right, and we need to have a custom.
Both the cases, if you implement the comparator, you can implement the two comparators and you can pass that comparator, right?
Yeah. See,
like which order you can take it.
Yeah. So, but see, when I say I am creating a new comparator, which actually implements the comparator interface, then inside that again I have to implement the compare function and all. So, right. But that approach would have been better if we were talking about a context of 1.7 Java development. But in 1.8, since it's a functional interface, we can directly specify the comparator object. So let's say here only it's like my lambda expression, right? So it actually let's say it I1 dot get price, right? And then let's say I2 dot get price, right? And if it is true, let's say it is greater, then I'll return, let's say 1, or again it will actually compare both, right? And that way, I mean, I hope you understood, right? So directly it will act as a comparator object based on the values we are returning from there. It will sort it. So let's say if it is an ascending order, then we'll keep the normal way of doing it. If it is greater, 1, less means -1, equals 0. If it is descending order, then if it is a greater, then we will be returning -1. If it is equal 0, and if it is less, then we will be giving 1, right? So that's we can do.
So did you see any reverse order method in a collection interface or collections classes?
Reverse.
Yes.
No, I haven't used. If it is there, I'm not aware of.
Okay, you can check that one. I think
Okay.
So the collection interface has all these facilities. You don't need to implement any logic, right? So
okay. Because in strings and all, again we do have, like I've used, but in collection directly I haven't. We always used to
streams also, right? I mean, for this case, if you take the simple tree set, and if we just pass the comparator interface, object, whatever the comparator object, it will take, it will take care of that. You don't need to implement any business logic there, right?
Yeah, true.
Okay, so that's fine. Okay, so let's suppose, how can you write a Java object into a file?
Java object into a file. So I can use a file input stream, right? And then I can use from the buffer I can read the file, right? The buffer will actually hold the the content which has to be written, and then I can once the descriptor is done, I can close it off once the return is done.
Okay, so what is a marker interface?
Yeah, so marker interfaces are basically blank interfaces, right? And they don't really have functions as such, but again they have some.
So do we need to any marker interface while writing Java object into a file?
Yeah, so like we have serializable clonable, right? So in the clonable we do have we don't really have any method as such, but when let's say a class is actually having this particular implementing this clonable, then we do use the super dot clone, right? So that's
okay. So what is a shallow cloning?
Sorry, which one?
Shallow cloning.
Okay, like we do have deep cloning and shallow, and again we also have the lazy cloning, I believe, right? So deep is when like we have all the fields we will be explicitly mentioning, right? And shallow is when we will directly specify super dot clone, so the implementation of the class, right, object class takes care of it, right? So we are not explicitly
okay, let's suppose if I have a cloned object, if I made any changes to the cloned object, so I want to change the original object values also. How can I do that?
Original also.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, I'm not sure.
Okay. So like when you are writing in a Java object into a file, for example, if I take the account class only, okay, I want to write only ID and name of the account, but I don't want to write the amount information, as amount is a sensitive data. Okay. Right. So how can I handle that kind of scenarios?
By implementing serializable, right?
So the serializable is the process.
Okay, sorry, I can make it transient. I can make it transient, yeah. So if I make the variable transient, it won't be part of the serialization, so it won't.
So what is an executor service?
Executor service of I forgot. I have actually read it, but I forgot.
So how can you do a multi-threading in Java?
Okay, so multi-threading can be achieved in Java by two methods, right? So the first approach is actually extending the thread class, and the second approach is by implementing the runnable interface, right? So thread class, the advantage is again it does provides its own methods, right, which you can use. And in runnable, there is since it's a functional interface, so again we only have one method, that is the run method, which has to be overridden by the the implementing class, right? So in the thread, it's quite simple. We'll directly create the object, and then we can just start the object, right, specifying our own run method, right? And in runnable, we have to make a class which actually extends the runnable interface, make an object, and then pass to a thread class object, right? So then again the question arrives, right, why do we need a runnable when we already have a thread? So the idea is quite simple. Since it's an interface, right, I mean the thread class is a class, right? So we cannot extend more than like one class because of the limitation. And in let's say we are going with a runnable interface, so since it's an interface, we can also extend like various other interfaces or one class that's there.
Okay, for example, when you are creating multiple threads, right? Okay. How can you decide, okay, I can create only these many threads for my process?
Okay, so each object will actually represent the thread, right? So let's say I'm creating like 5 threads, so it will be like 5. So and
okay, yeah. I mean like 5 threads, that's what my question. How can you decide, okay, I have to create 5 threads or 10 threads or 15 threads? Why cannot I create 100 threads, or why cannot I create one thread? Okay, so that again comes up to the limitation of the JVM, right? So let's say there are we are actually specifying, you see, it's not like thread is
I mean, it is not a free of cost, right? So we do have to give some resources to it. Let's say the CPU time, right? The memory and all. So I mean, I cannot just make like that. Based on the requirement, I'll be specifying, like how many I need, right? So that's that. But yeah, again, they are a lot more cheaper than the processes, right? So we go with threads.
No, let's suppose I have given a machine to you and you deployed your processing on that server, Linux server.
Okay.
Okay. So how can you judge or how can you decide, okay, you have to process like 1 lakh records are there, you have to process parallelly. For example, you are thinking to process of that 1 lakh records parallelly.
Okay.
So in that case, are you going to create 1 lakh threads, or you will divide
No.
it into 10 threads, or you will divide it into 50 threads? If you divide 10 threads, why did you go for 50, or why did you go for 20?
Okay. So that again comes up to the server, because the server also has a limitation of how many number of connections it can take up in one time, right? So based on that factor, I'll be deciding how many threads I need. Let's say there is a database which allows, let's say, 100 in one time. So I cannot send like 200 threads trying to access that, right? So that approach we can take. So that's why like I'll limit it based on the specifications.
You said you worked on Azure, right? Azure.
Yes.
Azure. Okay, so what is the load balancer? How Azure will maintain the load balancing?
Yeah, so actually when I say I have worked on Azure, it's not the proper cloud from the operation side, but from the development perspective. But again, since you asked this question, load balancer is internally provided by Azure. Whenever I'm creating, let's say we have an AKS, right? So we have Azure Kubernetes cluster there, right? So we do have one master node followed by the other nodes, right? The slave nodes. So what happens is whenever a request is made, it actually directly goes to the master, and master internally has a load balancer which is actually specified by the Azure guys itself, and that is not something we specify, right? But again, sorry, just 1 minute. Yeah. So but again, there is one thing, like we can actually limit the audience that can entertain it, so that is one thing that does provides Azure. So it is something which is more specific to Azure and not that we do from ourselves, because let's say when I specified 5 nodes or 10 nodes, right, internally the load balancer takes care of the distributing the load. Let's say one request comes, and how it has to be handled, it is taken care by the master itself, and since it's a managed service by Azure, so they take care of it.
Okay, so for example, if I ask you to design a load balancer component for our one of our microservice.
Okay.
So can you design that one, the load balancer?
Okay, I don't have an experience on that, but I can try. Okay, load balancer, right? So let's see.
So simply, what is the load balancer? As you said, right, you just need to know the status of the load which is going to a particular server, right?
Yeah, so I think we can do it this way. Let me just give an example theoretically. Let's say I have like 5 servers. Internally each server can take, let's say, two requests, or let's say one request at a time, right? So what I can do is I can write a method that actually polls each of the each of the servers, and like I can find out the values. Okay, let's say one is busy. That means there is a flag variable in the count variable which will tell, okay, how many requests it is already handling. So if it is plus, let's say it is already 1, then I'll go with the second one, and I'll be giving the value there, right? So that way I think we can do.
So did you work on Spring JDBC?
No, since we were working in microservices architecture, right? So all the services had their own specific database, and since we were using like Cosmos DB, right? Like if usually if with Azure we go with the Cosmos DB stack, so there it's like purely JPA, right? So we will, let's say
whatever it is, any DB, you need to connect to that DB, right? When through your application.
Yeah. So so how do we actually
connect?
Yeah, coming to that. So again I do have a repository interface, like, right, so which will sorry, it's a class like which will be extending the the Cosmos DB repository, in which I'll be specifying two fields. The first one is the model class, right, followed by the primary key, right. So primary key is something that is actually generated, like we have a method, right, it creates the UUID, that is so that is that. And again, then we give the enable Cosmos repository annotation and the document for the model, right. So, and again, we have to give the at configuration also, right. So it will ensure that, okay. And yeah, so in the like we do have a YAML file, right. So in the properties config, we have specified the connection string and the key, which actually is getting generated by a SAS key generator, right. So that's a utility method, and it gives a complete connection string. So using that particular connection string, it connects to the database, to the specified database, followed by again it stores in the JSON format, right. So that is how it actually stores whenever we are trying to save, and in the interface again we do have methods, right. So it will actually return me as list, right, list of that particular model class, right. And I can, let's say I want let's say there is a device table, right. So in the device table I have device ID, I have device registration ID, etc, etc, and I want to find all the devices that are in a specific location. Then I'll simply specify find all devices by location, and inside the as a parameter I'll specify the string which is the location. So that's how we used to do, right.
Okay, so let's suppose if I ask you to restrict the number of connections which are doing from your microservice. Okay, how can you restrict that?
Yeah, so this restriction can like we can actually configure it in the Azure database. So whenever I'm creating a new like a database,
but microservices are different microservice. For one microservice you have to configure 10, and one microservice you have to configure 20, like that.
Yeah.
So how can we do that in centralized Azure servers?
Okay.
I mean, why should we do it inside? I mean, why cannot we do from the application?
Okay, so from the application, I'm not sure how to do it, but actually our project is like a SOA based architecture, right? So it's like service oriented one.
Yes, microservices work.
Yeah. So whenever I'm creating a microservice, right? So that particular microservice actually has only one database, right? So whenever this particular the database is getting created, right? So there is something called as the RUDs, right? So reading units. Right, so in that particular read units I can limit, right, so how many read units I want. So that will actually limit the scope and also save the cost again, right. So because based on these number of connections the pricing also goes up, right. So that's the approach we are taking, but I'm not sure how we do it from the
actually our voice is getting low.
Hello, is it normal now?
Yeah, it is good now.
Okay, so what I was saying is, yeah, so in the whenever this particular like microservice we are creating, right, so that time itself that particular microservice will be tagged to a database, and while specifying, the creating the resource, right, in the resource group, we will specify for this particular let's say the Cosmos DB how many read units are needed, right. So as the read units grow, that is the number of connections, right. So it will actually go, the pricing will also go accordingly, right. And let's say I want less, then I'll reduce it, right. So that is the approach we have been taking. So I'm not sure if we can give a direct number from the application itself.
Okay, so what is the direct class you will use for the Cosmo database when you are connecting to the database by using Hibernate or JPA?
Yeah, so there is one class that specifies the interface, right, the repository interface, right, which will actually specify all the methods and all, and then there is another class over to which we have to use the repository, at enable Cosmos repository, and then we specify the base class package, which is basically the repository. So it actually so when the the context loads up, right, the Spring context, it actually tags everything. So that is how the dependency injection happens, right? And like we directly use it. So
what
then
is the difference between HTTP and HTTPS?
okay, so when I say HTTP, it is the protocol how we normally use it's, and when I say S, right, so it is like the secure, it's more secure, so it uses the SSL security, socket layer security, right? So internally how it actually works is based on the keys, right? So how many number of keys, and like the internal authentication happens, right? So that's there. So basically the idea is security. It's more secure when we say HTTPS and HTTP, and even if we go through the Chrome, right, it actually gives that it is not secure. So
Okay, so when you're exposing a REST service, okay. Okay, so as a client, I am sending XML request and I am expecting the XML response from your service.
okay. Actually,
How can
we
you
are
do?
using REST, right? So in the
Yes.
REST, yeah. So we deal with like JSONs. I'm not sure if XMLs. I mean, I don't have experience on that. So I can, but explain the same thing in form of JSONs. How we handle? Is it okay?
Okay, so what is the media type in REST services?
Media type we are using like raw JSON, I believe.
Okay, so can you, are you going to define anywhere in the media type when you are exposing the REST service?
Uh, whenever how we create is we do have a REST controller, right? Inside the REST controller we will have the access point, so that is like the request mapping how it happens, right? And inside that particular method it will be a get, post, it can be a put or a delete, right, based on the requirement what that endpoint is supposed to do. Let's say I have, let's say I have the same device database, right? So let's say I want to get all the devices, right? So
For example, what is the annotation of produces and consumes? Did you see those annotations?
no. How we actually have done is using the REST controller followed by the request mapping, right? And
Okay,
then
how
we
can you convert the Java object to JSON string?
yeah, so we can use the JSON, right? So JSON G is equal to new JSON, and then we can specify the object Pojo class. It
Okay,
converts it
so
to.
do you have any idea what is the API Spring Boot is using to conversion of that JSON string to Java objects or Java objects to JSON string?
In Spring, I'm not sure, but we were using JSON, so yeah.
Okay, how can you call one microservice from another microservice?
Okay, so in our project, like how they do is we use they see when I say SOA, right, so there was a master service, right? So in that master service we have a common utils which has implementation for all the calls to the other microservices, which we denoted them as the open API calls, right? So open API calls were like two ways, either it can be a get open API or a put open API. Yeah. So sorry, the post, right? So when I say the post, I'm sending some data along with so internally it uses REST templates, right? And then what actually happens is once we specify the URL followed by the body if it is a if it is a post call, right, and the JWTs, right? So that is how the authentication happens throughout the microservices, right? And then once the microservice reaches let's say the other one, we do have a endpoint that actually handles that particular request, right, and then processes and returns some response entity, right? And this particular response entity is further broken down to get body, so which actually gives the content that is being returned, right? So yeah.
So when you are exposing a microservice, okay, so it's just saving the record into the database. Let's assume.
Okay.
And there is no content when you are returning something back to the client.
Okay.
So what kind of status code you will return to the client to denote that okay there is no response content in the body?
Okay. Since you said we are actually saving some content, right? So
Yes.
Since it is saving some content, so it will be a post mapping, right? So since it is a post mapping, so I do expect some request param, right? So request body, which will actually have the data which has to be saved. Let's say there is a repository call that went on repository.save, the whole Pojo is saved now. Now, since let's say there is assuming that no exception occurs anywhere in midway, now I will actually return a status code of 201, right? So which will denote that okay, I mean, the object has been created, and let's say it's only a void kind of a method where I just wanted to retrieve some data, right? So I can also send the 200 and followed by the uh,
No, if
written.
you send the 200 status code again, if I'm as a client, I can depend on the 200 status code and I can get the content, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah, that's what
maybe
I'm
I
just
can
saying.
try
Like
to make
example, like let's say if like actually for creation of objects we go with 201, but let's say there is only a data which is like mostly for the get request, we go with the 200.
Okay. How can you handle exceptions in RESTful services, microservices?
Okay. So whenever I say exception handling, it is again an interrupted thing that occurs in the processing, and that is pretty much obvious thing that happens, right? So let's say usually the business logic happens inside the I mean the implementation. So we have an interface, and then we have the class that implements this particular business logic, right? So usually in that particular class there are chances that the exception might happen. So in case that happens, so we do have we can put it in a try catch block, right? Now again in our projects we directly used to go with the generic exception, right? And then like the exception, right? We didn't specify any custom exceptions, but again let's say if happens, then we will catch it, and then we will log that particular thing that okay, an exception has happened. And now again the question arises, okay, how do you know that okay it has happened? So we do have application insights. That's a feature that is given by Azure. So whenever you are deploying any project, so you can tag that particular project to the application insights. So what happens is in the application insight, it will show okay this
Okay, for example, I am storing the account object into the database by using one of the microservices. Okay. So for example, when I got the account object, and the amount should not less than 5,000, for example. Okay. So in that case, right, the client send me the 3,000 in the account in the request. Amount value. Okay, what we will do is inside that we will do some validations, right? If account is less than 5,000, I will throw the exception. Right. So whenever I am throwing the exception, right? So generally REST services, what they will do, if there is any exception comes from the server side, so it will by default the 500 status code it will give.
True.
Right, so instead of 500 status code for that exception, insufficient fund exception, for example, if insufficient fund exception, I want to get the 400 status code. Okay. So how can we map those kind of status codes based on the exceptions?
Yes, we can do, but that is not something that is recommended. How do we actually do is while returning the response entity, right? So I'll directly give the http dot inside the I can specify the like 404, right? So that is one way, but again that is not something usually one does, right? I mean in normal real-time
generally actually the Spring Boot generally just return the object or throw the exceptions, right? I mean, whenever you throw any exception, automatically it will map to the 500 status code. I don't know how can you change it to the 400 or 404 status codes.
Right. Okay.
Inside the code.
Okay. No, I didn't get, like, you want a specifically 404, or is it like?
Yeah, a 404 only I want to get it. Generally Spring will take care of that, like there is a valid tag, you use it, right? Automatically if invalid request, invalid in the sense if they send the null account, by default it will give the 404 saying that bad request, right?
Yeah, correct.
Right. So but once the code once the call enters into the code, into the server code, right? So account is not null, but amount is should not be less than 5,000.
Okay.
Right? And at that time what I will do is I throw some insufficient fund exception. Okay. From service or wherever it is, like I checked, I can put that condition in service layer or controller or DAO layer, right? So anywhere I throw that exception. So when I throw the exception, generally what REST services will do is it will map to the 500 status code saying that there is some server internal server exception.
Yes, that actually happens when, let's say, in the controller you're not again, handling it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So let's
Yeah,
say
but
in the controller itself, I have handled the request. Okay, let's say
mm-hmm.
there is the transaction which you specified, right? So let's say I'm trying to save, and in the business logic it is failing. So since I have a catch block, anyway the control will at least come to the controller back once the
Mm-hmm.
that call is over. So in that
Mm-hmm.
particular catch block, I can do whatever, like further requirements are, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I can, let's say, return HTTP request as, I mean, the HTTP status code as 404 or whatever.
Okay,
But
but my controller method return type is the object type. So, for example, I'm returning the account object back to the client.
okay, okay,
So in that case, how can you return the response entity object in the catch block?
okay. So in that case, um,
I think
okay,
generally we are returning Java objects, right? And if you see the Spring controllers,
okay,
generally we return the response, not the response entity or like that, right? We will generally return the Java objects mostly,
okay.
I guess.
Actually, that one thing, right? So according to our, I mean, in the coding standards that are being followed in our project, so everything has to be returned in for, I mean, wrapped as a a response entity, right? Object. So response
Okay.
entity. Then inside that I have the Pojo, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that is how we wrap and then we return. So
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah,
So
that's fine. If you follow that approach, that is fine.
yeah. So that is the thing we used to do. No, so I'm not aware of these scenarios.
Yeah, actually we have some exception mappers
Okay.
in REST services. Okay, so
Okay.
whenever we throw the 500 exception or we can map that kind of exception. Let's suppose insufficient exception. If we map that exception to the mapper, so under there we can throw the return the status code like different status codes.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so did you write any unit test cases?
Yes, and that is something that is part of our development cycle, right? So yeah, yeah, I've written.
Okay, so when you call one microservice from another microservice, right? So you return the test case for that microservice, and that is calling another microservice. So at the time of unit test cases, I don't want to invoke the service from the cloud, right?
Yeah. So
So how
we
can I test my data?
yeah. So we directly go with Mockito. We don't even actually make any random calls here and there because again it is performance costly, right? So we'll go with Mockito, right? So when I say Mockito, I'll directly specify, okay, when this happens, right? So then return, because let's say that's a post or something. I mean, let's say it's a get only where I'm expecting one Pojo, right? So I'll directly specify that particular the line will be when that particular function is being called, then I'll return this particular object. So that object is something which internally in that particular JUnit I would have defined. Now then there are other scenarios where there are chances that the service whichever I'm calling or the class which I'm trying to access is a final or a private class, right? So in those scenarios which are so what we do is we'll directly go with Power Mockito, right? The again the functions are pretty much same, but yeah, we have to use Power Mockito there, right? So that is how
Okay,
we used to do.
so what is the default dependency scope in Maven?
Uh, Default in the sense like.
So what is the dependency in Maven?
Okay, dependency. So what happens is in order to run, let's say one whole piece of code, right? So there are chances we need to let's say for Spring itself, right? So we do have many dependencies, right? So we have the web dependency, we have the dev tools, we have actuators, right? So these dependencies are these files are not something which we have written or we have in our class path, right? So in order to download them, right? So I'll specify in the POM file, right? And this will be downloaded then and it will be placed in my class path so that whenever I'm trying to use them, I can directly use.
Okay, I need a dependency which should require only for the test cases.
Okay.
Okay, how can I tell the Maven or a project by using Maven? Okay, please build this jar only for test cases. How can you do that by using
Okay.
Maven?
Oh yeah, then we can go with the scopes. Yes, we can specify the scope as test there, right? So if we have given the scope as test, then whenever we are doing Maven test, it will use it like that. So that particular
Okay, so how can you lock the version of a dependency?
logging the version of a dependency.
Lock, not log.
Lock.
Lock.
Okay, not sure how
For
to
example,
lock.
three different developers are using. For
Mm-hmm.
example, I don't want to use the one developer is one version and another developer is using another version.
Okay.
We will get conflicts, right? Let's suppose if you use the, let's suppose 1.2, if I use the 1.3, right? So conflict will come, right? How can you manage by using Maven?
Okay. Not sure how we log the thing because yeah, because
so what is the profile? What is the profile in form.xml?
Profile. Okay. Not sure. I don't know.
I think you worked on CI/CD, right?
Yes, to some extent.
Okay, so you did not go through the Maven for the CI/CD?
Yeah, so how we used to actually do is that was a POC project that was given like a presentation to the client in order to acquire the project, right? So what we actually did is we set up our own AKS and we had our own Jenkins server there, right? So in the Jenkins the server, right? So we had various stages, right? So once, let's say, so back then we were using Azure, sorry, AWS, right? So we went with JFrog Artifactory for Artifactory storing, and then because we were not using directly Dockers, right? So how we actually did is we had a Jenkins file which includes like all the stages which are supposed to go through in the pipeline, right? And in the that Jenkins file was something which actually had the code, right? And since I was like way too beginner back then, right? I was like just started out, so I was not someone who was handling those files. But again, yeah, that is the approach how it was being done, right? So we used to create, let's say, new resources, new pipelines, and then we used to specify these Jenkins files in it, right? So that those
okay,
things
so
are
did you work on any JMS concepts, messaging concepts?
Not really.
Okay, that's it, Sai, from my side. So you have any questions to me?
Yeah, I do have one question. Let's say things go well and I happen to join your organization in span of a time. So what things you would like me to learn so that it will help me,
Yeah, mostly I think whatever the things you are following, but we are not using Azure like the things, right? So we are using our own private cloud, actually, which is built by the client. Okay. But learning wise, you cannot learn from outside, but you have some understanding of the cloud, right? So it's fine. Only the thing is you need to understand more about this Spring JDBC and Spring JMS, because we are purely into that areas mostly. Okay. My clients are working in the eventing mechanism because logistics project we are working. Okay. And apart from that, XMLs, more into the XMLs. Okay. And JSON's also there, but it depends on the client actually, right? So architecture based on the architecture, so we will take the decision whether we go for the XML or JSON. Okay. So based on that, we are going to design the services by using Spring. Okay. And we are also following the microservices architecture mostly. Okay. So we need to call a lot of services to integrate the data, save the data or whatever it is. Okay, so morely we are into the Spring Boot, JDBC, okay, Spring JDBC, Spring JMS, and what you said like CI/CD, okay, continuous integration and deployments by using Jenkins and Maven, okay, and we are using the Git for this code repository. Yes. So from your end, I am expecting to learn like JDBC and as well as JMS. Okay, sure. So how to connect to the JMS, like you can take any time, Kafka or ReactiveMQ or RabbitMQ. How can we connect to a queues or topics, or how can we listen a message from a queue or topics? Okay.
Actually, we did have that in our project. We call it like the event hubs, right? So how actually happens is, let's say there is a service which did some action, and that action has to be told to the IoT hub that this particular action has been done, right? So we cannot directly go with the traditional approach of where one service is calling the other and then it tells the other one. So what we
Yeah,
used to
but
do is,
really we have a scope, like if you can explore, like Azure, and if you have some good hands-on, right? So we can put you like those kind of projects based on your performance. Like
yeah,
if you
surely,
have any
surely.
requirements, IoT and Azure projects also there. But those are as part of the R&D teams. So we have those projects, but this requirement is not for those R&D teams. Okay, this requirement is for the specifically for client.
Okay.
IoT and Azure or whatever, Kubernetes, all those things we are not having, but we have our private cloud which is implemented by client. So we have to use that cloud only.
Okay.
So, but main focus is the purely Java. Okay, Java position. This is for Java position. You have to work on Java.
Sure, sure, sure. That's and even the technology which you specified, they sound quite nice to work for. So I would love to work on that.
Yeah. Okay, okay, Sai. So thanks for your time.
Sure. Thank you, Ramesh.